Okay, what I got here are 5 questions, and I'll try and just get through these as quickly as possible, because I do have 30 minutes here, and so I'll get through these first 5 that have been that you seem to be the priority questions, and then take questions from the floor for the remainder of the time here. What are your thoughts on evolution theory fitting with intelligent design? Quick answer would be, I would be prepared, for the sake of argument, to grant any. There's a difference between the process and whether intelligence was involved in the process. Okay, so the process is an entirely different question. The real question is, as far as intelligent design scientists go, is whether or not intelligence was at any point involved in that process. And so that's where in intelligent design is actually embedded in science in 3 major areas. One is design application, which is what we do all the time. For example, I mentioned artificial proteins that we're building now, the simple ones. That's intelligent design. That's design application. That's where you take an intelligent entity with a problem, a goal in mind, and build something to meet that goal, i.e. a completely novel protein. Well, in this case, not completely novel, but still, we made it ourselves. The other major area is design derivation, and that's what we call reverse engineering, where we have an item that's been produced by some intelligent agency, and then we take it apart to see how it works. Sergeant Polenko, 1975, flew a MiG-25 into Japan. Western world never got their hands on one of those. It was the fastest interceptor in the world at that time. How does this work? They then performed reverse engineering. Genetics is the biggest reverse engineering project we've ever been involved in. That is, we got this, you start with a massive complex finished product, work your way down to first principles. Design application, start with first principles, work your way up to a massive finished product like this laptop. I've defined intelligent design, an example of intelligent design as an effect that requires intelligence to produce. So this laptop would be an example of intelligent design. Third area in science would be design detection. Obviously, SETI is involved in that, looking for intelligent signals and signals from intelligent sources in space, but we use it a lot in archaeology. Forensic science, heavily dependent on design detection. That is, determining whether it was natural causes or foul play. Was there, and again, some sort of a system has to be designed there. It's now an issue in biology. Ventnor Institute produced an artificial genome for M. genitalium a few years ago and encoded 5 different proper nouns in the genome representing various people who worked there, or the name of the institute. So, and with genetic engineering now and copyrighted and patented genomes, it helps if you can actually encode some sort of copyright within the genome that will stand up in a court of law. So design detection in biology is now an issue. It was already an issue when people said, hey, those molecular machines look designed, are they really designed or not? So what are your thoughts on evolution theory fitting with intelligent design? Quick answer, evolution could be a process. One of the processes by which it came about could be, I have an entire lecture on this, because intelligent design does produce a model that I think is, as our advances in sciences are revealing, is more closely, actually explains the data better. Not just this. Explains a number of things. I'll mention another one in a question that I see is already here. So I would deal with the 2 separately. All we're worried about is, let's say you find a guy laying on his face in an apartment, knife in his back. Forensic scientist says, who did this? The religious person comes, no, not the religious person. The guy down the street, uneducated, says, I don't know, maybe Bob did it down the street. Well, what links Bob to this? And there's nothing to link Bob to this. Just because you don't know what did that doesn't mean Bob did it. But what if Bob's fingerprints are all over the knife? Now we have a link between, we have a reason to believe Bob did it, but we still don't know what process was involved. How did Bob do it? What was going on? That's commonly the case in trials, where you have a good idea who did it, but the prosecution, the Crown Attorney, police detectives have to come up with a more thorough analysis of how this occurred.
Could you repeat the question?
The question was, what are your thoughts on evolutionary theory fitting with intelligent design?
Okay, thank you.
So, I would say treat the two separately, same with forensic science. Whether Bob did it or not is one issue, and how Bob did it or how it was done is another. And sometimes in certain crime scenes, there'll be a mix of natural processes plus Bob, so to speak, or some human. How does this prove a new Earth or old Earth? It's actually irrelevant to that, the old Earth, new Earth aspect of things. Interestingly, I'll just throw this out, there are two major views on time, major ideas or concepts of time. Physical or substantive metric time, which most scientists say is what we live in here, what I talked about, it's real, substantive. And then there's the other view of time where it's a concept that you measure by events, and if nothing happens, no time elapses. That is non-metric relational time. And if God is timeless, that's the only time that when God looked at time, God would look at our physical time, our metric, substantive time, from the perspective of a relational, non-metric viewpoint. I'll suggest an article to you. Where would you find it? Email me and I'll give you the PDF. I can't remember the reference here. I'll give you the PDF, but it helps. But if the creation account is written from a non-metric relational view of time, where you measure time in terms of packages of events, and there's some, and God actually uses that way of time in the Bible. Things like a day with God is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. Makes no sense, but literally it's true if God's perspective of time is from a relational, non-metric perspective. So the issue, that would resolve the issue of whether the universe is old or young. It would, in metric time, non-metric, so let's say there's a window here, and I exist in relational non-metric, from non-metric, I exist in a state of timelessness. So two events, let's say you saw two events, me take 2 sips. From my perspective, and there's a number of problems with this analogy, and if you're really into space-time, you'll see it instantly, but it's very difficult to explain the relationship, so you hopefully get the idea. Let's say I took 2 sips of coffee. Now, in real life, you need time for that to occur, but in a relational time, all that happens in the 2 sips. And let's say, from your perspective, this was 6 billion years between the time I took the first sip and the second sip. But from a timeless, relational, non-metric perspective, no time at all elapsed. Because time is a concept, it's not real. Whereas in your case, it's real. You live in physical time. There's an arrow of time that takes you forever forward. So, short answer, new Earth, old Earth, irrelevant to whether or not intelligent design. What you're really looking for is evidence. If you guys see the fingerprints there, then you have good reason to believe intelligence was involved in the origin of life, regardless of whatever process you might want. The process is an entirely different discussion. Where does carbon dating fit in here? Again, as I said before, it's actually irrelevant. Now, interestingly, our entire dating system was based on the assumption that the decay constants were constant. We know that's not true anymore. A few papers just came out a few years ago. We now know that the decay constants do seem to be influenced by something. We think it's neutrino flux, and so there'll be experiments going on over the next decade or so. We know that the decay constant suddenly increases quite rapidly according to plots, hundreds of plots. In fact, I actually have a plot of that here. Cancel. Oops, what did I cancel? Nothing, I guess. Here's one published in Archive, Astrophysics. This, you'll see that the decay constant goes up and down here relative to our distance from the sun. But it's not the distance from the sun, they don't think. It's got to be something to do with the flux, perhaps the neutrino flux from the sun. And there's a real spike there, which tells us it's not just directly correlates to distance. It's got to be something else, neutrino flux or whatever. So all I would say is that there are a couple of articles that out there, but that if that was always the way it was, then you could still take the average of the two and come up with a reasonably accurate dating system. So, but the question is, was the neutrino flux in the region of the Earth always constant? Almost certainly no. But we're traveling at 100,000 miles an hour, 160,000 K an hour around the center of the galaxy, going through regions of different fluxes. The sun itself is different, so we don't know. But I'll just throw that out there. C14, though, has a small enough half-life that we could be I think, reasonably confident it's given us not that bad of dates from that C14. Longer decay constants, now that becomes an issue because there's more time for the neutrino flux to vary. But again, irrelevant to whether or not intelligence was involved in the origin of life. Second question, why couldn't the universe be eternal? Why does it need a point of creation? And there was a very closely related question here as well, that a universe always existed. What created, I'll answer the two together. What created God and what gave God the power to create? Okay, recall my argument there that God, omega is necessarily timeless, so when you write what created God, you're smuggling time back into the reference frame of God. God has to be timeless. Pardon?
Relational time.
Well, then you cannot have a sequence of events, like a non-relational time doesn't see things in a sequence. It's more of a coordinate system, so you would measure relational time as event X, Y, Z, whatever. But there's no before or after. It's anything in relational time. Like when you're in relational time, relative to us, you saw there was a time when I did not take my sip, and then there was a time that I did. But relative to relational time, those sips are always there.
Is this not the idea that if you basically, if you take the sequence of an arrow flying and take it at any moment, it's not actually moving?
No, it's more like if you have a ball stationary on this table here. From our perspective, it looks stationary, but from a timeless being, it's a long cylinder that goes from two regions of what we call the past and the future. And so, and same with any event, let's say the bouncing of a ball, each time it hits the floor, there looks to be a before and after to us, but from being in relational time, that before and after is always there. It's always there. It's never not there. Now, admittedly, we have a hard time wrapping our minds around this sort of thing, but regarding why not have the universe be the eternal thing, well, there's a number of reasons for that. One is that just our observations about matter itself is that the universe does appear to be expanding, and so you work your way backwards, you come to a point where it supposedly had a beginning. What kind of beginning? Up for arguments. Whether it's a singularity, although they're resurrecting the singularity I see here, which I don't like, because a singularity to me is logically absurd, but it's a point of infinite density. So I'm not sure maybe it was the writers that did it. But, or it could be an extended region of space-time that begins as, in which case you have different histories that are not actually connected to each other in this universe. But that's reason number one, is that empirically, that is observationally in science, it appears that the universe did have a beginning. So that's one reason, empirically. But there's another couple of reasons you could say that do bring to bear on this. George Ellis brings this up. Ellis is a colleague of Hawking's, and he brought it out last year in an article responding to all these different multiverse theories. And he pointed out that you cannot have an infinite number of multiverses. And there was a fellow by the name of David Hilbert, and Ellis mentions this, is that what David Hilbert, the mathematician David Hilbert, did in this paper, it's called On the Infinite, and he showed that in that paper, he discussed the problem of an actual countable infinite in reality leads to logical absurdities that he talked about. If you want to Google Hilbert's Hotel, you'll see an example, a kind of an illustration of logical absurdities that arise. Whenever you have logical contradictions or logical absurdities, you know that can't be possible. Either that or it's ditch science at that point, or ditch logic, one or the other, and we don't want to ditch logic, so we have to say that a countable infinite is logically impossible. What that means, you cannot have a countable infinite number of previous universes, or this universe can't be eternal as having a countable infinite number of hours or years in the past. Now, if you have a diminishing, let's say of an hour, so to speak, is decreases in actual extent in elapsed time. This gets that you can have an infinite amount of time increments, but it's not countable anymore. There's a difference between a countable infinite and non-countable, and that's why in Zeno's paradoxes you have a race that had a finite distance away, but familiar with that, that's the solution to that, because you can actually sum an infinite series, but if x goes to 0 too quickly, it actually has a finite number as a sum. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a universe that's actually infinite. So let me put it this way. And what that means is that there was a year, there was a, let's call it an event, an interval that has a time-elapsed time greater than 0, infinitely far back in the past. That's what, when you ask that question, what you are hoping for or suggesting. So let's take a quantum leap infinitely far back in the past, and let's count our way down to this event. We're calling event 0. So we're at minus infinity here, but it's not an imaginary event. It really did happen in the past. Let's count down now. Infinity minus 1, infinity minus 2, infinity minus 3. When will we arrive at this event? For a countable infinite set of events, we will never get here. So an infinite regression is not possible in the past that have real things. Yes?
Just as a point, you say there can't be an infinite number of regressions, but at the same time, you're using infinity to judge a creation. So, like, a creator is supposed to exist infinitely outside of time. You're using it as an infinity, but at the same time, discounting another infinity. That seems kind of like circular logic.
Well, not really, because I never used the word infinity when I describe God. I know lots of people use that, but when they use the word God is infinite, ask them, what do you mean by that? Because we use the term infinite different ways. They might use the term, they're not using it as a countable infinite, let's say, size of God. Let's say he's like X number of kilograms. They're not really using, if they were using it in that term, your objection would stand, because now we have another example of a countable infinite, which is logically impossible. But people, when they use that term, usually mean something like there is no limit to something. But I'd say question them on that. That's what I do. When somebody says God is infinite, my first question, what do you mean by that? And ask them to flesh that out. If they are talking about a countable infinite, that does not violate this principle infinity. Whenever it does, then I say that's a legitimate red flag. The philosopher, the theologian, then has to back up and say, wait a sec, we've got a violation of, we've got a case of Hilbert's Hotel here. So your objection is perfectly valid and is a good red flag for sloppy talking on account of those people who use the word infinity around. We got the time marching. Man, that's okay. Why couldn't the universe be traversed? There was another, so you can't traverse an infinite regression. You'll never get here. No matter how far you go, there will always be an infinite number of events to occur before we get here. You'll never get here. Yet here we are, and that's the bottom line that Ellis brings out in his article, talking about the multiverses, is that the actual infinite is absurd, and therefore there has to be a finite number of whatever universes that's past, or universes in a multiverse system. If everything is perfectly engineered, then why do we have seemingly useless body parts? For example, the appendix. There's actually been a number of papers out recently in the last 10 years about why, and another one was just published within the last 12 months. The appendix is now considered to be an important part of our makeup. It's a repository for bacteria that can get wiped out in a severe sickness event. It actually replenishes the intestines. And these are papers published in the peer-reviewed literature. However, let's look at this design theory a little bit closer. If we know from everything else we observe that all information storage media are the information degrades. We know that. So what you would predict within the information that encodes life is that it's degrading. It's actually disintegrating, it's becoming corrupted. And we do have very good evidence in two of the major things we've been studying for many decades now that that's occurring. First of all, the bacterial genomes seem to be degrading and getting shorter. Paper by Mira first was the one I first brought that out as far as I'm aware of. A more recent paper, Drosophila, the fruit fly. The Drosophila genome seems to be getting shorter and it's losing information. Not a surprise. That's what happens in reality, is that information runs downhill, it deteriorates into exactly the opposite of what you predict under Darwinian theory, where you start with zero information and it increases to everything that defines life today. In the design hypothesis, you start off with a downloading of all the information for life, and from that point on it degrades. We now know we have an enormous number of mutations in our own genome. We don't know what those genes used to do. We don't know what would happen, what a human would look like if they were back in operation again. In other words, we have an increasing number of defects. So we will predict that there will be things that may have once had a use that today don't appear useful at all. And as we continue to deteriorate, we'll eventually go to extinction. There'll be less and less about, people look at that time and say, what are those things hanging from your shoulders, man? I mean, what a useless piece of appendage. Well, they won't know that, say, X number of aeons ago, there used to be arms and they were actually quite useful. But everything's degenerating. So that's the prediction here, is that everything's degenerating. Don't assume that your information that codes for you is perfect, because it is definitely not. It is running down. Last question here. If science is the tool to discover nature and a personal God can break the rules of nature, i.e. miracles, wouldn't science be undermined and less trustworthy? I don't like this idea of breaking the rules. I see the laws of nature as an operating system. Just describe it that way. There's an operating system that determines how space-time, matter, and energy interact, but that operating system is embedded within a larger operating system. Okay? So when I write software, I can run things in Python. It's a smaller operating system within the larger Mac OS. And so in that smaller operating system, because I come through it for the larger operating system, I can do things that I suppose little people living in the Python operating system would see as external inputs that aren't explained just entirely on the basis of the rules of the computer language called Python. Just not explained. Where'd that come from? How did this get here? What's going on? But I'm not breaking the rules of Python when I do that. I am using those rules to encode things that I want to have happen. I want that system to be able to do things. So it's not a violation of those rules. It's an external, think of embedded operating systems. So it's a larger operating system interacting with an embedded operating system. And makes perfect sense to me, yes.
Wouldn't that still be undermining science, though? Because we cannot see this external operating system, so there would still be so much that we cannot explain. Since most miracles are things that we literally have zero explanation for, that is what makes it a miracle. So if those miracles exist, we can't really trust the information we get through from science because we don't know. Like, we may have a hypothesis and theory for what happened, but we don't know if a miracle occurred during that, so our explanation could be completely false.
It could be. It could be. Like, I was laying in bed one night, and the window was open, and the leaves were rustling outside, and that just sounded so nice. And so I just had to talk to God. I just had to, who I think is the origin of beauty itself. That's a beautiful stuff. And then I thought to myself, wait a second. I thought, I would describe, what caused those leaves to rustle? I would think a pressure differential with the air moving from one region to another would rustle those leaves, but how do I know God didn't do it? I don't. Nevertheless, in this world, if what the Bible says is true, there are laws that govern the universe, and so we need to take them seriously. And so whenever I see stuff happen in this universe, my first job as a scientist is to say, well, is there a natural explanation? That's the job of science, so we can't just assume it's a miracle and say, well, let's not investigate that, that'd be a miracle. No, I would say quite the opposite. Let's use the tools of science to investigate that to see if indeed it was. In fact, we're not really testing it to see if it was a miracle. We're just trying to figure out how it happened, and maybe down the road we do figure out how it's happened, so to speak. So I don't see it as undermining science. I see that science plugs on regardless. It's just like, here's the rules. It's like God says, Kurt, here's a sheet of rules, go for it, and that's all I'm given. And if he does miracles, my sheet of rules don't account for that. All I can work with is a sheet of rules. So I go ahead and I analyze everything in terms of that sheet of rules by laws of nature. Now, there are events that could happen that I'd say, you can assign probabilities. How probable is this that nature could have pulled that one off? I've seen one or two events that, wow, there's either a science is really at its beginning stage or that was a miracle one way or another. But still, like my dad, for example, had a miracle happen to him, to the spine. And the first thing I did was, okay, we had the x-ray before, let's get the x-ray afterwards. And that was my first response. Like, as a scientist. I want to investigate this. I want to see the before and after stuff that I don't trust. In fact, as soon as I hear somebody saying this was a miracle, you know, I tend to be skeptical. I've seen an awful lot of people claiming to see miracles when in fact upon further investigation they were making it up. It was wishful thinking, whatever, or it's perfectly explainable. You know. So science, that's our tools. We just apply it. If you say a miracle happened right over there, first thing I would do, bring the tools of science. That's its job. So it's not going to undermine science. Sure, God can blow the whistle and say, I'm just stepping in here into the operating system and I'm going to make somebody rise from the dead after they've been dead for a few days. Fine. But even then, a scientist, I would love to investigate that. I would just love to. I'd like to set up cameras. I'd like to set up body monitors, all this sort of thing.
Okay, so if we do witness a miracle, then science can't explain that. So science could incorrectly prove its hypothesis wrong because of that miracle happening.
Science could explain something and it could still be a miracle. Like, how do I know the leaves were rustled by God or by a pressure differential? I don't know, but as a scientist, we just go with the pressure differential thing here because we know it works. Okay. If you do see a miracle, science could fail to explain that, but it doesn't mean it was a miracle. It just means that maybe our science is not developed sufficiently far enough to explain that. So I don't think you can scientifically prove that anything is a miracle, because there's always the undiscovered science of tomorrow.
Well, yeah, but in the hypothetical situation where, like, it's 100% a miracle happened, like, just say we know it's a miracle, like,
okay.
as a thought experiment.
Okay.
Science has this hypothesis. This miracle goes directly against that hypothesis.
Well, I think if it was a miracle, by definition, that's something that, maybe by definition, that's something that the physical laws of nature are incapable of producing. Therefore, science would not likely to have a hypothesis on that. Or if it did, it would be falsified very quickly.
Well, yeah, so like, just say like a random new species appear right out of the blue, like a brand new species not related to anything.
Yeah.
That would pretty well prove evolution. What? Yeah.
We have a theory about death, and yet he can raise people back from the death. To say death is now not a valid, like, that's not a scientifically valid proposition, because we have, in one example, let's say.
We can resuscitate organisms that
but
die.
That's not true death.
Yeah, well, that's the definition. Yeah.
Well, the thing
Can I
is
just put
that
in there for a second? It's past 7, so you are dismissed if you would like.
I'll hang around for a few minutes, and
there is no class in here afterwards, so if you want to stick around, you can get some coffee or hot chocolate back there. As you're leaving, can you fill out your surveys or hand it to someone as you're going? And also we have books at the side table over here if you'd like to check them out.